Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. I'm John Podesta. I'm the president of the center. And I want to welcome you to the launch of the Progressive Studies program at CAP, which we are excited about. John Halpin and Rui Teixeira, senior fellows at CAP and co-directors of the Progressive Studies program, will tell you much more about the project itself and present some of the fascinating findings from two reports that we're releasing today. I also want to thank Mark Schmidt and Mark Lopez, lots of Johns, lots of Marks around here, for joining us today and offering their thoughts on the reports. Let me start by saying that all of this great work would not be possible without the partnership and support of the Glazer Progress Foundation in Seattle. We started working with Rob Glazer and Martin Collier a few years ago to begin developing ways to present progressive values to the public through a series of innovative advertising treatments that drew on the historical victories of the progressive movement and also on core philosophical contrasts with conservatives. Many of you may have seen those ads, which John really spearheaded, and we'll talk about that a little bit later probably in the program. In developing that work, we learned two important lessons. One, you cannot build a coherent, cohesive, progressive identity without first having a clear understanding of your own history and intellectual foundation. John and I tried to capture that insight into our book, The Power of Progress. The other lesson that we learned was that no matter how much we think we know about what Americans think, rest assured the American public has many different impulses, emphases, and competing values that must be explored if we are to engage people on their own terms. The product of that joint work is the Progressive Studies program at CAP, an interdisciplinary project exploring the history, intellectual foundations, and public understanding of progressivism in America. We're in the process of developing a series of educational projects around the intellectual development component, and today we're presenting the data side of the project. Let me just briefly offer some context for the data itself, which John and Rui will go into in more depth. If you step back and look at what has occurred over the past 5 years or so, there's been an amazing transformation in American politics, not just in electoral terms, but also in terms of ideological attitudes. After nearly 3 decades of playing on a field that was tilted towards public acceptance of what I might call the Reagan-Bush model of conservatism, limited government, tax cuts for the wealthy, traditional values, and military strength, we've now moved to a position of broad and deep support for a range of progressive attitudes about government and society. We've moved from market fundamentalism, supply-side tax cuts, and deregulation of the economy to widespread support for sustainability and energy transformation, public investment in education and science, financial support for the poor, elderly, and sick, regulation of business to protect workers and consumers, and guaranteed affordable health coverage for every American. On the international front, we've turned away from the Bush neoconservative legacy towards a much greater interest in restoring the country's image abroad, pursuing security through diplomacy, alliances, and international institutions, and fighting climate change. As this research shows, at least 2/3 of Americans, reaching to 70 to 80% on some measures, agree with progressive ideas in each of these domestic and global areas. That's actually a pretty seismic shift in attitudes that didn't just occur on its own. The work of the broader progressive movement in challenging conservatives and promoting new ideas, certainly the state of our economy brought low by the implementation of those conservative ideas, and of course I think the campaign that was just run in 2008 played a tremendous role in setting the stage for an agenda of this magnitude. But as this research also shows, the conservative worldview maintains latent strength. Conservatism is down, but it's not dead. While America is decidedly progressive in its worldview, it is still about evenly split when it comes to political self-identity. So our job isn't done. We have to turn these core progressive values and demands, which have strong support, into concrete policy shifts that work for the American public. It's our job to promote and execute what began with the early progressives at the turn of the 20th century and was carried on through the actions of people like Franklin Roosevelt, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. King, Lyndon Johnson, and Bill Clinton, and activists of all stripes. We hope this new Progressive Studies program will help contribute to that effort, and we thank you for joining us today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Rui to tell you more about the data in these studies and to tell you a little bit more about the program. John?
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody. My name is John Halpin. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. And with another senior fellow here, Rui Teixeira, we're the co-directors of the new Progressive Studies program. If I could just take a few minutes before we dive into a wealth of data that I'm sure you're interested in seeing. I just want to thank a few people that made this launch possible. John mentioned, obviously, the folks at Glaser, but in particular, I want to thank Martin Collier, who's the executive director of the Glaser Foundation. He's really been a tremendous partner in developing all this work, and we very much appreciate all of his support and that of Rob Glaser. I also want to recognize Carl Agney, who is my co-author on the poll report, as well as his partner Jim Gerstein of Gerstein Agney Strategic Communications. They helped design and conduct the research that I'm presenting today. On the CAP side, all these mind-numbing data trends and points that you see were really brought to life by our fantastic editorial and graphic design team: Ed Paisley, Andrew Sherry, Shannon Ryan, Matt Pusateri, and Evan Hensley. I don't know if you had a chance to see the actual reports. We didn't print them out because they're very long, and one of our primary consensus values is to conserve energy and consume fewer goods, so we decided to let you all get those online. But there's also a really neat version of the survey that you can take yourself. We call it a progressive quiz, and it takes the core 40 questions from our survey and allows you to measure how relatively conservative or progressive you are. So I encourage you to do that. We also have a neat interactive map that's just chock full of all sorts of county level voting trends and public opinion data that really help put together with folks on our online team. And from the communications and event side, many thanks to Susie Emmerling, John Norm, Vanessa Cardenas, Anna Solner, Jennifer Palmieri, Faz Shakir, Alex Pryor, James Heidbreder, and Aaron Green for all their work in helping us get this off the ground today and publicizing the information. Let me formally introduce our two respondents today. First is Mark Lopez. He's the Associate Director of the Pew Hispanic Center, where he studies political engagement among Latinos and helps to coordinate the center's national surveys. Prior to joining Pew, he was the Research Director at the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at the University of Maryland. It has a nice acronym of CIRCLE, which is easier than saying all those words, I think. He's now a visiting professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy as well. And fortunately, he's going to keep an eye on our quantitative methods here. He's a PhD in economics, so he's very good with data and survey research. We also have Mark Schmidt, who's the executive editor of the American Prospect. He's been a contributor to the Prospect since 2001. He was formerly a senior fellow at the New America Foundation across town here, and was a program director at the Open Society Institute. He served for many years as the policy director for Senator Bill Bradley, and I've really enjoyed my own conversations with Mark over the years on political history and the intellectual foundations of progressivism and liberalism, so he's going to offer some neat context on that. Let me just briefly, before jumping into the results of the poll, expand a little bit on what the Progressive Studies program is going to do. As John said, the program is divided into two primary areas. One is an examination of the history, political thought, and philosophy of progressivism and its relationship to other ideologies and American politics more broadly. We are just now designing a series of interesting lectures, book events, debates, online educational tools, and trainings for young people and activists that we hope will spark more internal and external discussions about the nature of progressive thought. Right now we're looking to launching an informal Progressivism on Tap series, which will bring together interesting speakers with regular folks in cities and local watering holes to discuss some of the great ideas of progressive thought and history. We're working on a series of training modules and retreats for young folks and activists to dive into some of these core values. On the substantive side, we're looking to explore a whole range of things, from how the ideas of Jefferson and Hamilton have shaped progressive politics, to the importance of Abraham Lincoln in the progressive movement. We'll look at major writers and thinkers from Herbert Crowley and Walter Lippmann to John Dewey and John Galbraith. We plan to explore major social movements that John and I discussed in our book, dealing with the settlement houses and the social gospel tradition. We're going to look at the rise of labor, civil rights, women's, and environmental movements throughout the 20th century. And we hope to dive in more specifically into the key intellectual foundations of major public policy debates, whether it's progressive taxation and regulation or international cooperation and human rights, a whole range of things. The second part of this larger program is a data analysis and public opinion arm. And what we want to do here is to examine American attitudes about all of these abstract ideas that we're going to talk about in the other part of the program. So let me first start by presenting quickly some of the results from a major new study we did. We did two separate studies here of American ideological attitudes. One was with a 1,400 sample survey of the public at large, and we did a companion survey of what is generally referred to as the millennial generation. We're going to release the youth results at a later date. When you came in, I think I hope everybody has a copy of this. There's a table 1 from our report, which is a list that, the core of the survey we did was to ask people a battery of 40 questions about the role of government, culture and society, international affairs, and economic and domestic policy. And all these statements were written as fundamental values, 20 affirmative ideas from the progressive side, 20 from the conservative side. And what we did was create a composite score, which I'll explain in a minute. But what you see on table 1 here is a rank order of the 40 ideas that really political ideas that really shape American politics. And this is ranked on the total level of agreement. At the very top of the list, there's some interesting trends here before we dive into the composite measures. At the very top of the list, a complete consensus idea is the notion that Americans should adopt a more sustainable lifestyle by conserving energy and consuming fewer goods. 80% of Americans overall agree with this notion. 47% strongly agree. What you see throughout this table here is that most of the ideas with the strongest consensus in America right now are what might be called progressive ideas. Sustainability, the need for government investment in education and science and infrastructure, the energy transformation to renewable energy, restoring America's positive image abroad, the need for universal health care, a range of other things. Of the top 15 statements with at least 60% support, only 4 are conservative. And they're not the core part of conservative ideology. What is interesting, and you'll notice starting at the bottom of page 1 and onto the top of page 2, this is a very important point that John alluded to, there still remains residual strength for the conservative worldview. If you'll see here that the core of the conservative perspective on anything from issues of life to free markets to cutting taxes to the role of the traditional family, reform of Social Security, the importance of military force, limited government, all of these basic values, ideological values, enjoy majority support among Americans. So even though we're in a period of much stronger consensus around progressive ideas, the conservative worldview still has a lot of latent strength, and we'll get into what that means. What you'll also notice as you go through this table is that the issues surrounding the status of African Americans in society, immigration, labor unions, talking with enemies, all of these things remain deeply contested ideas, and they lead to most of the polarization that we see throughout the survey. Things like deficits and the impact of regulation on business, people are pretty ambivalent about this thing. I was struck. It would be interesting to track this over time, particularly on the deficit measure, whether that changes. Now, what does all this data mean? What we did was we took the answers. Again, it's on a 0 to 10 scale, and if anybody's taken the progressive quiz yet, you've seen it. You rank from disagree to agree on a 0 to 10 scale. We aggregated all of these into a new composite measure of ideology in America. And what you see here is that you get a composite score of 209.5 on a 0 to 400 scale. It's a very simple scale, actually, and 0 would be the most conservative position, meaning maximum agreement with conservative ideas and maximum disagreement with progressive ones. 400 is the most progressive point on the continuum. That's maximum agreement with progressive ideas, maximum disagreement with conservative ones. So what you see here is that the nation as a whole, its average score, it's solidly progressive, but not excessively so. What you see in the various categories that make up the composite mean score, Americans overall are more progressive on the role of government, and less so on cultural and social beliefs, with international affairs and economic and domestic policy somewhere in between. When we go to the next graph here, this is one of the more interesting findings, the actual range of opinion of groups in the United States ranges from about 160.6 to 247.1. You've got conservative Republicans at one end and liberal Democrats at the other. What's interesting about this is that you see that ideological attitudes overall converge in the middle. No one group approaches either extreme on either side of the continuum. So what this tells us, in my mind, is that there are many ideas that Americans may believe on their own side that they're not fully convinced of, and that Americans simultaneously are open to a range of ideas on the other side. The conceptualization that you frequently see in some commentary that we have a far right and a far left pole is not actually accurate. When you look at the American public as a whole, it's more accurate to say there's a far center right and a far center left. One of the more interesting things that comes out of this when you dive into some of these groups is the education gap in America. A lot of people talk about the divisions between partisanship and ideology. One of the more stark findings we found throughout the poll is the division in attitudes between non-college educated Americans and college educated ones. And just to give you a little bit of flavor about this, when you compare the range of questions we asked, the 40 that you have, between those with a high school degree or less and those with a postgraduate degree, those non-college educated Americans are far more populist in their attitudes about government and economics, and much more conservative in their attitudes about cultural values and national security. For example, those with a high school degree or less are 18 points more likely to strongly agree than postgraduate elites that government policies that too often serve the interests of corporations and the wealthy. They're 16 points more likely to strongly agree that the gap between the rich and poor should be reduced, even if it means higher taxes for the wealthy. They're 17 points more likely to agree that labor unions play a positive role in our economy. At the same time, these non-college voters are 17 points more likely to strongly agree that human life begins at conception. They're 28 points more likely to strongly agree that immigrants today are a burden on our society. They're 34 points higher on the notion that America has taken too large a role in the world. So what you see is an emerging division between two worldviews, not necessarily defined by ideology, but defined by divisions in education in America. I think it's a pretty fascinating finding. Just quickly, interesting map our good design folks put together here. This shows you some of the differences by region. The East and the West are more progressive in aggregate than those in the South and central regions. There are even bigger divisions between those in rural areas, suburban areas, and urban areas, with urban areas being far more progressive than rural areas. Perhaps not surprising, but we have some quantitative measures on that. The next thing we did after looking at the actual, one of the things we wanted to do in measuring ideology was to see what people actually believe. That's the composite score you just saw. The next part we wanted to examine was what we think is a more complex and rich understanding of how people identify themselves. The traditional ideological breakdown in this country is on a 3-point scale that you see through most polling: liberal, moderate, conservative. With that breakdown, you get roughly, for a long period of time, about 1/5 of Americans identifying as liberal, and roughly about 40% in moderate and conservative categories, respectively. We decided to ask what we think is a better actual understanding of the varieties of labels that people might apply to themselves. We came up with a 5-point measure: liberal, progressive, moderate, conservative, and libertarian. And what you see in this graph here is that when you ask this 5-point scale, you get a different picture in many ways of self-identification of ideology. 15% of the country identifies as liberal, 16% progressive, 29% moderate, 34% conservative, and 2% libertarian. We then asked, we also know that moderates in many cases lean towards one side or another. So when we had a follow-up question with moderates about which direction they lean on these other ideologies, you get this graph on the right, which is almost a perfectly even divide between a 47% block of people who identify as progressive and liberal and a 48% block of those who identify as conservative or libertarian. One of the things you see here, these ideological labels match up pretty well based on partisanship. You've got roughly 25% each of Democrats identifying as liberal or progressive. Independents, a plurality, identify as moderate, and Republicans overwhelmingly identify as conservative. But one of the more interesting things, again, is the fluidity of opinion across labels. So what you actually find when you take these labels and match them to the 40 questions that I outlined earlier, you see that a majority of conservatives agree with 4 out of 5 progressive positions on the role of government. Conversely, a majority of liberals and progressives agree with conservative positions on certain things on the economy, particularly free trade and Social Security. Interesting trend there. One of the more interesting findings in this poll is the public favorability towards various ideological approaches. And we've tracked a lot of this data basically since the Center for American Progress started in 2003, 2004. The most significant finding here is the substantial increase in public favorability towards progressive as an approach to politics. And you can see in this graph here that from 2004 to 2009, there's been a 22% net favorable increase in perceptions about progressive. Almost all of this came from a block of people in 2004 who didn't identify the term or were unable to give it a rating. So basically what's happened over the past 5 years is that this large block of people who couldn't identify progressive came in with at least somewhat favorable opinions of it. If you'll see now, conservative and progressive are equally favorable among the American public at 67% apiece. I think it's a really interesting finding. A sub-finding here that you might find fascinating is that although we frequently talk about conservatives and libertarians being very aligned, we found some pretty stark differences. We couldn't fully analyze libertarians because we got a small sample. But one of the things you notice is that conservatives don't rate the libertarian label very well at all. Only 35% of self-identified conservatives rate libertarian favorably. Conversely, when you look at the libertarians that we got in the survey, there's some big differences. Core alignment on government issues and econ issues, massive divergences on culture and national security, and actually the support for Senator McCain in 2008 was much lower among libertarians than it was among conservatives at large. Let's get to this one here. We then went into, trying to speed this up a bit, we asked a number of interesting questions about more abstract values in American life. And we presented people with a list of things and asked them which 2 of these American political values are most important to you. Not surprisingly, given the Jeffersonian origins of the country, liberty is the chief value, selected by 42% of people. It doesn't add up to 100 because we allowed people to pick 2. But what's interesting here is the division, but not division, it's actually just some emphasis. Progressives and Democrats put more emphasis on values like equality and opportunity, while conservatives and Republicans tend to put more on liberty, free enterprise, and justice. I think that's an interesting finding. We also probed how people are dealing with the current environment. Not surprisingly, you've got a huge block of people who say that their incomes aren't keeping up with the cost of living. Again, stressing the education divide here. When you break out that group, you see that among non-college educated Americans, the percentage who feel like their incomes are falling behind is much greater than those who are college educated. This education gap continues on perceptions about the American dream. We asked people whether they have achieved it, they think they will achieve it in their lifetime or won't achieve it. And overall, 34% say they have achieved it, 41% are optimistic that they will, and 18% are convinced that they will not achieve it. What's most interesting here, again, is the division between non-college and college educated. Postgraduate educated Americans, 50% of them say they've already achieved the American dream, compared to 30% of those with a high school degree or less. A full quarter of high school or less educated Americans say they will not achieve it, compared to only 5% of postgraduates. Again, some of that divisions in worldview there. We also, if you want to understand sort of the macro context for why Americans seem to be very progressive in some of their attitudes today, you get some sense of it with this graph here. We ask people to choose between competing visions about the common good and individual liberty. The top question asks people to, says government should do more to promote the common good versus government should do more to promote individual liberty. By 60 to 40% margin, people favor the government doing more to promote the common good at this point. A roughly equal breakdown favors what might be called an FDR-style vision of freedom, one that says it requires economic opportunity and basic measures of security, housing, old age protection, things like that. You get about the same percentage saying they prefer that vision of freedom over a more classically liberal one, where people are free to make their own decisions and live with the consequences. Finally, let me just end up with some interesting data we have on perceptions about the new president. Not surprisingly, in the next couple of numbers, what you're starting to see here are clear signs that conservatives are hardening in opposition to the president. President Obama's overall job approval is 58% in this poll. But if you look at this graph here, you'll see on the left and the right, 42% of conservatives disapprove of Obama's job performance, and a full 53% of Republicans. Interestingly, President Obama wrote in his 2006 book that I serve as a blank screen on which vastly different political stripes project their own view. We put this theory to a test and asked people to rate or describe President Obama's own political perspective. And what you get, people tend to lean towards progressive and liberal overall, but there are massive divisions here. You do get this I'm a blank screen idea for liberals, moderates, and progressives. A plurality of liberals say he's a liberal. A plurality of moderates say he's a moderate. A large plurality of progressives say he's a progressive. On the first column there, you'll see that a majority of conservatives think Obama's a liberal. And so what you're starting to see is a hardening of opposition and a belief that his perspective is different from their own. You see, similarly here, we asked people for, this may not show up too well, I apologize, it's in the report. We asked people for a one-word description, a phrase or a word to describe President Obama. Overall, they're overwhelmingly positive. It's basically personal qualities about the president or how he embodies change. If you look at the two columns on the right, you'll see that among conservatives, they're just as likely to say that he's not up to the job or can't be trusted. You'll notice that I believe it's 14% of Republicans call him a socialist, which is interesting in and of itself. But what's clear from this, that's an interesting segue into the finale here. Given the clear preference for progressive priorities and values that the president himself has outlined in his joint address to Congress and the budget, it's not surprising that the president is doing well. Conservatism, as John said, is not dead, but I think until and unless conservatives recognize the depth of affinity between the president's values and priorities and those of the American public, it's likely that many conservative ideas will remain in secondary status. So those are just some of the conclusions and findings we have from this survey. I now want to turn it over to my partner here, Rui Teixeira, who's going to march you through some of the interesting demographic and electoral trends that have occurred over the past 20 years. So thank you very much.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. All right, so with the election of Barack Obama and all the various public opinion data from our survey, and there's lots more out there besides, I think it's fair to say something called the new progressive America is kind of with us today. So where did it come from and where is it going? That's really the subject of my report, which is available online, the new progressive America, and I'm just going to present some of the data from that here today. There is more, oh so much more in the report, so I do urge you to check it out. Well, one thing that lies behind this new progressive America is the increasing share of the vote that comes from minorities. This is some exit poll data. 15% of voters in 1988 were minorities. In the last presidential election, 26%. 11-point shift over 20 years. That's about half a percentage point a year. In demographic terms, that's just startling how fast things are changing. And minorities, and this is how they voted in 2008, 80% to 18% for Barack Obama, huge 62-point margin. In our survey, minorities are far higher than white voters on all of the four indices that we have in the survey: culture, role of government, economics, and international issues. And minorities, Hispanics are particularly high in the role of government, and interesting enough on cultural values. Sometimes Hispanics are characterized as having very conservative social positions. That's not what we found in our survey. Blacks tend to be the highest of all the race ethnic groups in economic issues. But across the board, quite progressive on the part of minority voters. In the future, where's this going? Well, we're going to have more and more minorities. That's where it's going. these are the population projections by race from the Census Bureau to the year 2050. The year 2042 is the year we're going to become a majority-minority nation, according to the census. There'll be 54% minorities by the time of 2050. You can see non-Hispanic whites going down by 20 points, and a doubling of the Hispanic population from 15 to 30%. So basically, in the most simplest possible terms, you're swapping out, whites for Hispanics fundamentally. I mean, also some Asians, but what's really driving it is that swap out, and you're basically exchanging people who have much more progressive views on all the issues we've discussed for people who have, well, somewhat less progressive views. So that's going to make a difference to this new progressive America going forward. Now, another thing that's really benefited progressives over time is the increasingly progressive tendencies of white college graduate voters. If you look at these data from 1988 to 2008 in the exit polls, there was a 20-point deficit for Dukakis in 1988. In 2008 for Barack Obama, only a 4-point deficit. That's a 16-point pro-progressive swing from between the two elections. In our survey, and again, this is consistent with other data, white college graduate voters overall, compared to white non-college voters with less than a 4-year degree or white working class voters, white college graduate voters are far more progressive on international issues, far more progressive on cultural issues, and interestingly, somewhat more progressive on the role of government, because white working class voters tend to be very susceptible to conservative arguments about how government can't work and it's completely wasteful and just throwing money down a rat hole. So overall, white college voters are actually somewhat more progressive on the role of government. And some of the economic issues not quite as progressive as white working class voters, particularly in some of the more populist things, as John was mentioning. Now let's, whoops. Okay, did I? Now I'm going.
Let's do it here.
Yeah, maybe just do it here. I'm losing track. So we need to be at the progressive deficit among the white working class, wherever that is. Oh, you got to actually cycle back through it. Yeah, there we go. You just that's it. My God, that's it. I know those data. Okay, so these are the progressive deficits among the white working class voters. And as you can see, 20-point deficit in 1988, 23 points in 2004, that was Kerry's debacle. An improvement in 2008 to 18 points, but not a big one. So between the two elections, there's not a huge shift. And again, these white working class voters really quite conservative on cultural and foreign policy issues, and actually fairly conservative in the role of government. So these voters have not been voting for progressives. I guess I can try this again to see if, yes, there we go. Well, let's put it all together in terms of how the electorate's shifting over time then. Over a 20-year period, a 15-point drop in the percent of voters that are from the white working class. 3/4 of a point a year. A 4-point increase in white college graduates, and 11-point increase in minority voters. So basically, we're swapping out white working class voters for white college graduate and minority voters, who, especially minority voters, are far more progressive than white working class voters at this point in time. So that's a huge benefit to the progressives, and that's just going to continue because these trends are going to continue, these demographic trends that are reshaping the American electorate. Now, how did this affect a lot of the states that were critical in the 2008 election? Well, basically, you see the same pattern that I was outlining on a national level in state after critical state. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and Nevada are shown here. Look at these changes. They're just phenomenal. 25-point decline in white working class voters as a share of voters between 1988 and 2008. 16-point increase in white college graduate voters, 8-point increase in minorities. And on the other hand, you have Nevada, same level of decrease in white working class voters, a 19-point increase in minority voters. A percentage point a year, that's an increase that we're still seeing today. You get about a percentage point a year increase in Nevada in minority voters, and a smaller increase in white college graduates. But again, the actual parameters of the shift changes from state to state, but state after state you see exactly this pattern. Very sharp and steady decline in white working class voters, and taking their place a much more progressive minority and white college voters, graduate voters. So that's going to be quite an influence going forward. Okay, this is, I'm not going to be able to go back. Oh, there we go. Can we go back to I missed the millennial. Well, anyway, I remember the data. So how did millennials vote in 2008, you ask? Well, they voted 66 to 32 for Barack Obama. In fact, there they are arriving at the polls. There's my slide. So that's a pretty, and this is the first election in which millennial generation, those born after 1978, were the entire group of 18 to 29-year-olds. So something's going on with these millennials, and in fact, we confirm it in our poll. Millennials tend to be much more progressive across the board in all four of our indices, particularly in cultural and international issues. They're just really quite different than the generations that preceded them, and those views seem to be moving them toward a candidate like Barack Obama in large numbers. So let's see if I can get to this next slide. Okay. And how many are we going to have in the future? Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I've looked at that. In fact, the way things are working now, if we look at the census projections, we're going to have 4.5 million more millennial eligible voters added to the electorate every year into the year 2018. That's a lot of new voters, and that's a lot of new voters who at this point look like they're leaning pretty heavily progressive. So we had 48 million in 2008. We're going to have 64 million when Barack Obama runs for re-election in 2012. Then 81 million in 2016. And by the time they're all in the electorate, which will be the presidential election of 2020, there'll be 90 million millennial eligible voters in the electorate. That's quite substantial. And again, if they keep on doing what they've been doing, that's very good news for progressives. There are a number of other growing groups that are important for progressives. One is single women, college-educated women. I can't show here because they haven't released the data yet, the exit polls. But look at how single women voted in 2008, 70 to 29 for Barack Obama. Single women are going to continue to grow as a percent of women voters, probably. They've gone up from about 38 to 47% of adult women since the early 70s. Working women actually were very good too for Barack Obama, 60 to 39. Again, we look in our poll, it was only 51-48 for John Kerry. But if you look at our poll, single women, again, in each of our indices, if you look at cultural, you look at international, you look at the role of government, particularly look at economic issues, single women are much more progressive than married women. So again, we have a kind of swap out taking place where less progressive voters are being their place is being taken by others. Now here's an important part of the progressive coalition today. John mentioned how progressive postgraduates are, and cultural and international is very true, kind of off the charts. They're also relative to the population as a whole, quite progressive on the other issues as well, including the role of government, particularly in international and cultural issues. Look at how they've been voting, just going up the ladder for progressive candidates and giving Barack Obama an 18-point margin in 2008. This is basically, most of these people tend to be professionals. It's kind of the rise of the professional class, a class whose views really are quite consistent at this point with where progressives are coming from. So another part of what's going on too is the growth of religious diversity in our country. Not everyone's a white evangelical Protestant, we know that. And one thing that is happening in our country is we have a larger group of people who don't attend church that much, even though they may consider themselves among the faithful. According to the University of Chicago's General Social Survey, you have about 42% of people, about 29% of people said they went to church only a few times a year or never back in the 70s. Today it's up to about 42%. And look at how those people are voting. You can see the data there from the 2008 exit poll. This was just confirmed by the release of a new version of the American Religious Identification Survey, the fastest growing sector of the religious kind of spectrum in the United States is people who have no religion, who are not affiliated. They may in fact have some spiritual values they adhere to or in some ways consider them, but they're just not affiliated. In that sense, they have no religion. Those people voted extremely heavily for Barack Obama. Again, we look at our survey, we see these people are off the charts in terms of the level of progressivism, particularly, as you might guess, in cultural issues. They're just really remarkably progressive in that sense. So let's take it, let's kind of move the screen out to geography now. And where are these trends coming together? Where white working class voters are declining, where white college graduates and especially minorities are increasing, where single women and professionals are growing. Where are all these trends coming together, these progressive constituencies? They're coming together in our largest metro areas where most of the growth is taking place, secondarily in our medium metro areas and down to the deep rural areas. And you can see here the shifts that have taken place since 1988 in these areas. These large metro areas are metro areas that have populations of over 1 million. There's 51 of these metro areas. That's 54% of the U.S. population are in those 51 metros. The shift that has taken place toward progressives in this 20-year span is 21 points in large metros, 15 points in the medium metros, which is between 250,000 and 1 million. That's another 20% of the population. Then only 7 points in the small metros. Then in small town rural, or micropolitan as it's called, only 2 points. And then the deep rural counties where basically hardly anybody lives, the progressives have actually lost ground by 6 points. So I think you kind of see a pattern there of what's going on in terms of the different geographical types. And then we can take a look at, finally, go back to those states we talked about, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and Nevada, which loomed so large in the 2008 election. Where is the growth taking place in these, or the heaviest growth in these states? It tends to be, well, for example, in Pennsylvania, it's around Philadelphia, well, also in the Allentown area and down in the Harrisburg area, but Philadelphia suburbs especially are what's really growing. 32-point shift toward progressives over that 20-year period. Basically, not much is growing in Ohio, but they are growing in the Columbus area. That's really the growth center of Ohio. 31-point shift toward progressives over the time period. Orlando was Disney World. The I-4 in the I-4 corridor is one of the fastest growth areas in Florida, though Florida is generally a fast-growing state. Orlando is the fastest growing of the 4 large metros. An incredible 48-point shift toward progressives over the 20-year time span. Finally, Las Vegas and Nevada. Nevada is really all about Las Vegas. Nevada, the fastest growing state in the United States, and Las Vegas Metro is the fastest growing part of Nevada. A 35-point shift toward progressives over the time period. So I don't think it's hard to see the message here, which is that where America is growing, progressives are growing. Where America's going in the future is exactly where progressives are gaining strength. If you put all these demographic and geographic trends together, it suggests that not only are we looking at a country that leans progressive at this time, but all these trends should take us farther in that direction in the future and sort of increase that lean, make those views stronger, and provide perhaps a better basis for implementing progressive policies. At least that's the way it looks to me. So I just urge you to take a look at the report. Thanks.
Thanks. That's a lot of data to absorb. So to put all this in some perspective, we've asked Mark and Mark to take some time to give their own thoughts about what they read and poke holes in it and give us some alternative interpretations, things like that. Mark, Lopez, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much. I wanted to say I really enjoyed reading both reports, and thank you for including me on the panel today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to talk about, let me actually talk about Rui's report first, since that's fresh in our minds. I want to talk about a couple of things. I think that a lot of what's in here is really quite interesting, and when I was a research director at Circle, we saw many of these patterns happening as well. Young people certainly leaning more Democrat, more progressive. We certainly had seen that happening. But one of the things I think that's interesting about the millennials is that we noticed at Circle, and Rui, I'd be interested in your reaction to this, is that to a large extent, the youth population is much more diverse than the general U.S. population, and that a lot of the movement towards the Democratic Party or towards a progressive view has really been driven by the growing diversity of the youth population. When you look at 2004, not 2008, but in 2004, white youth ages 18 to 29 supported George Bush by about 10 points. But when you look at Hispanics, you look at African Americans, you look at Asian Americans, you see that among those youth groups, you see a lot of support for the Democratic candidate. It depends on which group we talk about, but generally speaking, it was minority youth who supported Kerry. It was white youth who supported Bush. In 2008, though, again, we see minority youth strongly supporting the Democratic candidate Barack Obama. We also saw among white youth, though, support for Barack Obama, though not quite as strong as we see among general minority youth. So I say that to a large extent, the future of America is a more diverse America, and we're seeing it now. It's that age group of 18 to 29-year-olds who are very diverse, and that's probably the sort of patterns we're going to see going into the future with a strongly Democrat-leaning youth population. But let's talk a little bit about Latinos, because I'm from the Pew Hispanic Center, and so I want to talk to you about Latinos, and Latinos I think are an interesting group to talk about. A couple of things about Latinos. While Latinos today represent 15% of the entire U.S. population, they're the single largest minority group in the United States, and among adults they represent 13% of the U.S. population. many of them are ineligible to vote. They're ineligible to vote because they're not U.S. citizens, and in fact, about half of the adult population of Hispanics is actually foreign-born, more than half. So you've got a tremendous number of Latinos who are unable to vote because they're not U.S. citizens. Second reason, they're under 18. So there's these two mechanical reasons for why Hispanics maybe haven't quite achieved the political power that you might have expected, given the relative size of their population. But as Rui correctly points out, moving forward, that share of the population will be Hispanic will double by 2050. We also expect that the Pew Hispanic Center, by about 2040, Hispanics will, in terms of their percentage of the population that they represent that's eligible to vote, should very closely match the percentage of the adult population overall. But it won't be until about 2040, 2050 where we really see the share of the population that's Hispanic equal the share of voters who we expect to be Hispanic. So that's going to take some time. But what this also points to is that every election, every presidential election, about an additional 2 million Latinos become eligible to vote. And every election, the number of Hispanics who actually cast votes has actually been growing. So while they're still at a relative disadvantage, their numbers are going up. But let me move to John's paper and talk a little bit about the data set. And first say, I really enjoyed reading the paper. As an academic, because I guess I'm still kind of an academic and the type of guy who looks at surveys, I found the breadth of questions that were covered tremendous. This was really useful to see, and I would love to be able to, I haven't played with the quiz yet, but I'm glad to hear that there's a quiz online. So this breadth of questions is fantastic. It gives you a lot of depth of information about the views of Americans. A couple of things though. First, something that's a little bit fun that I thought was interesting. Now, we usually talk about the liberal news media, and if you look at the list of people who are saying that they're progressive but watch national daily television or daily news, they're actually less progressive on this scale than the general population. So they're below the average. So folks who are watching national television news are less progressive, and I don't know where the liberal news media comes in on this, compared to the general population. Second thing, I did think it was very interesting to see Latinos at the top of all the minority groups in terms of being progressive. Now, at the Pew Hispanic Center, we've certainly seen Latinos leaning more this way in their public opinion viewpoints, particularly on immigration issues. However, one of the things in talking to John and Rui about the data set was, and this is a caution, is that the sample doesn't include a Spanish-speaking sample. So unfortunately, the survey wasn't asked in Spanish. That's okay, but it's something to be cautious about when looking at these particular results, particularly for Hispanics. I don't think the inclusion of a Spanish-speaking sample will necessarily change things very much, but it might change some of the results in the relative ranking of Hispanics. In terms of the big one thing that I took away from this that I thought that was really, really interesting was this issue about education. The divide between those who are non-college educated versus those who are college educated is tremendous in terms of many things such as civic engagement, in terms of economic success, etc. At Circle, we concentrated on this a lot because it's an important rift in the data. Whenever you look at data, you see tremendous differences. So I was very interested to see many of these differences here. And I do think that differences in education may also be tied with particular ethnic groups, once again returning to Hispanics, who generally don't have the same levels of educational attainment as their non-Hispanic counterparts. I'm going to stop there because I know we want to open this up to questions, but I want to say again, thank you for the opportunity to comment on both of these papers, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate it. Mark Schmidt?
Thank you. You set a standard for brevity, Mark, which I hope I can equal. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really thrilled, among other things, that there is such a thing as the Progressive Studies program at CAP. I think it's a really, it's one of those elements that's always been missing as we sort of think about the progressive infrastructure, is that capacity to think about our history and what it means to be a progressive. And you know, this is the beginning of I hope of a very, very rich program. I'm sure it will be, and it's really thrilling to feel present at this moment of enormous demographic and political transition. I'm kind of interested, I guess, in thinking about how we got, you know, any poll, as they will always say, is a snapshot of a moment. I think this is a very broad snapshot covering a very resilient range of time, but I'm still interested in kind of how we got to this point and then where it could potentially go. And I'm always, of course, wary of any straight line projection into the future, whether it was, you know, Karl Rove's 30 years of Republican rule or anything else. I've been the other day. I'm sometimes very often the old guy these days, and being the old guy means I remember 1993, 94 as something other than sophomore year. And somebody asked me the other day, well, back in 93, 94, did they do all that socialism stuff about Clinton? Were they using that word the way the conservatives have been using it now about Obama in a quite hilarious way? And the answer is no, because they had the word liberal, and if you look at all the TV ads from that period, they were all just like liberal. They had a special announcer who could pronounce the word in a particular heavy tone. And eventually it kind of wore out. It wore out, and perfectly fine to have the word progressive, which actually is a distinctly different word, as I think the polls indicate. But it wouldn't matter if you used the word liberal in the way that it did back then. What's interesting about that is the word liberal conveyed a lot besides economics. It was really about kind of the misunderstandings of the 60s and 70s. It was about race. It was about welfare. It was about culture wars. It was a word loaded with a lot of stuff. Whereas the word socialism, other than a vague sense of 19th century Germans or something like that, is basically an economic. It's basically purely an economic accusation. It's not loaded with all that with all that history, and I think is an indication that history has kind of fallen away. The 60s and 70s, the misunderstandings that kind of led to the classic breakdown of liberalism have fallen off. There's a lot to that. A lot of it is generational. People don't. It's a long time since it passed. A lot of it is things that happened with President Clinton. Things like welfare reform took some of those things off the table. The growing racial, the white kids in the millennial generation live in a much more racially diverse environment than white working class voters of an older generation. So there are a lot of reasons that the racial dimension is softened. It hasn't gone away, but it certainly doesn't have the same power. So that the conservatives' ability to sort of break this thing down by pushing the same old buttons that they pushed in 1993, even by using a different word like socialism, aren't really going to work as well, largely for reasons of the demographics, and that's why it was great to have Rui's paper coupled with John's and the public opinion poll. What was interesting to me as that happened is that Rui has one statement in his paper where he says kind of the culture war ended, all the culture pieces have kind of fallen off, other than basically a kind of backlash against conservative meddling. Tolerance values are the cultural values that are highest here, and everything rests on economic values. What's really interesting to me is that the economic values that rank at the very top in the large survey that John talked about they're not necessarily the things we would have been talking about, say, 5 years ago. They're values that, the number one is Americans should adopt a more sustainable lifestyle by conserving energy and consuming fewer goods. It takes until 11 where you get something that has any kind of hard populist edge. Government policies to serve the interests of corporations and the wealthy. This is not. This is an economic mood. It's progressive, and its brand of progressivism is more like late Jimmy Carter than early Bill Clinton. It's values of sustainability, future orientation, patience, willing to think about reducing consumption, diminished expectations, all those things that we write off as Reagan's Morning in America captured, showed that you can't talk in that kind of language, and then a more vigorous populist language that sort of speaks to everybody as if they're the little guy and will stand up to the power. I think. John. I expect John will disagree with me about this, but it's really interesting how prevalent these values that are really about cooperation and future orientation are. Really quite astounding. And then when I look at it and realize the degree to which it all rests on economic values. There's really not. This is the essence of this kind of progressivism is really about making this economy work again, rebuilding a kind of prosperity, is a really a reminder of how much is at stake in actually making it work. Of course, you can have all the values in the world, and we really have to make it work. I think what's great about the depth and resilience of the values and the demographics that support those values is that it will allow the administration to do some things that if it were an edgier time would be so much harder to do. Of course, healthcare prevalent among them. There will always be a certain amount of resistance, fear, backlash about healthcare, anything you do with that. If you have enough of a resilient majority, a resilient consensus, you can get through that, and then you come out on the other side with a value that's implemented in a way that people are beginning to feel like this works for them. Healthcare, of course, is central to not just to individuals getting healthcare, but to companies being able to hire and not be terrified about that cost and the changes in that cost and things like that, so that you come out on the other side of that, and then where are you? I mean, I think at a certain point you will have a conservative Republican movement that responds to this in a way that's very different from the way they're responding to it now, which is just hit the 1993-94 button over and over again and see if it works. That adjusts to those facts of progressive governance, not just the attitudes of progressive governance, but the reality and success of it. And then you have something that looks a lot, a very good model. We actually have an article about it in the last issue of the magazine. Looks a lot like what's happened with the Conservative Party in Great Britain right now. It took them 10 years after the Blair election until they found David Cameron as a leader. And he's not Michael Steele. He's not it's not the off the hook Conservative Party, but it's a matter of accepting certain things as the basic assumptions and expectations of life in Great Britain right now. For example, adopting the goal of ending child poverty, stripping the Conservative Party of its anti-immigration and xenophobic attitudes. It took a lot to do that. It will take the Republican Party and conservatism a lot to strip itself of the policies and values and attitudes that led it to the situation that it's in. And if after a good many years of conservative of progressive governance, we were to have a Republican president who accepted all those things on the ground, that would be would not be the end of the world, just as the Eisenhower presidency wasn't the end of the world. And I think that's what I like to think of the things in those terms as opposed to the a 30-year dominance. But I think both the demographics and the polling shows that all the conditions are in place if you're able to do the policies right to actually create something where progressive values turn into facts and the facts last and reinforce progressive values.
Thanks a lot, Mark and Mark. One of the interesting things that we see in this is that, Mark mentioned it here, what's considered to be radical by conservatives today is actually mainstream consensus opinion for the rest of America. So your point about Cameron, I think, is well taken, that this is one of the things that seems to confound the other side about President Obama. He seems to have found that center spot in many ways. It's an interesting trend. Rui, I don't know if you want to respond to anything that you heard here, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from you all.
Oh, just a couple of remarks, I guess. We do know that white millennials, white 18 to 29-year-olds in this election did support Barack Obama by 10 points. So that's an indicator maybe of some kind of change. In fact, we know that if you look at white working class voters, look at that group and then break it down by age, the most liberal or progressive leaning members of that group tend to be the 18 to 29-year-olds. So this is this change, I think, this generational shift is going to sweep across a lot of these different categories and change things. Your point is well taken. A lot of Hispanics obviously can't vote, and I discussed that some in a disproportionate amount, and I discussed this some in the paper. But I was fascinated by your remark that we're converging. In fact, there's an estimate that by 2040, the percent of Hispanic eligible voters will equal the percent of all eligible voters. Very, very interesting. And Mark, your point about the culture wars is also something I expanded upon a lot in the paper. And it really is hard to look at these these multiple and interacting shifts in the population that are going to take place and that have taken place and will take place in the next 10, 15, 20 years, and not see that the ground is just being cut out from under culture wars as we have known it, and hopefully won't know it in the future. And this is a big, and leads into all the other things you were talking about in terms of what we're really going to be debating and what the Republican Party conservatives are really going to have to do to get back in the ballgame. I don't know if they'll be, what the version of Eisenhower Republicans will be in this era, but it'd be interesting to see. But they're not quite there yet, I think.
Great. Well, again, thanks to everybody, and thanks for listening to a lot of dense but very informative presentations, I think. Susie's she has a microphone here. If you any questions, please raise your hand. We'll try and get to as many as we can. If you wouldn't mind just stating your name, where you're from, something about yourself, and then direct your question to somebody on the panel, or you can address to everybody, but please try and keep them kind of sharp and not 6-part questions, because I'm getting old and have trouble keeping them all in line. So, we'll start up front here. Yeah.
I'm Marty Birnbaum. I'm a frequent visitor to most of what you do. Just one thing, did you rank the ideas, all 40 ideas, as to which are important to the people that, or would you rank them based on how total acceptance, but the 40, which are more important than the others?
Yes, that's what Table 1 is.
What do you mean by important?
But in terms of importance,
the idea itself, not the people who talked about.
There are many things. If we had an unlimited amount of time to interview people and an unlimited budget, yes, we could have replicated the exact 40 with the priorities of each one and matched it up. But it's hard enough to keep people on the phone.
It seems to me excused then when you don't do that. If I'm the most important thing to me is putting food on the table for my kids. I really don't care. Number 2 is might as well be 30.
Well, they are randomized in terms of the
just to be clear, okay. These are presented one by one. We do not ask them to rank order them. We're presenting the results as they came back to us. So you get to rate each one, and presumably, if you care deeply about it on either side, you rate it at a much higher level.
Right.
We're just presenting. They didn't hear all 40 and say, I like this one more than that one. They responded to each one. So yeah. Over here. Yeah.
Hi, Stephen Dahl, returned from Oxford University. What demographic trends do you think this progressive movement shares with previous U.S. progressive movements?
Well, I think our forthcoming report on this, once we figure out the answer, we'll tell you. Now, that's a fascinating question, and I'd love to delve into that. But first I'd have to be a bit more of an expert than I am on demographic shifts and, from the 1880s to 1920. I mean, the big changes there were the rise of industrialism, certain waves of immigration coming in. I don't know. I'm just gonna have to punt on that one.
I mean, most of it is historical data. You can, directly comparing the data is almost impossible to do. There's some understanding that the trends Rui outlined. The Progressive Coalition is far more diverse than it used to be. I mean, I think we know that the divisions on race were pretty substantial, particularly geographic divisions on this. So if you look at the New Deal Coalition, and again, the data is not clear on this, but I would imagine that it looks like the Progressive Coalition has become much more diverse, not only in the people who inhabit it, but in their views in many ways. Let's go. Oh, we have it. We have
an answer.
Yes.
I think I would refer back. I would refer the questioner back to a book I often cite, which is David Gondrelli's book on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, and the shift to a more progressive posture of immigrant labor, women in the workforce, and ultimately with Al Smith's candidacy in 1928, Catholics moving to essentially a core part of the New Deal Democratic coalition.
Yeah, there's no question that the rise of immigrant populations in major American cities coincided with a substantial rise in support for progressive politics. John's point is really
add into that the middle class, the educated middle class. They were pretty key in the progressive era, and it looks like they're playing a role like that now too.
Let's go back and we'll start coming forward. Green. green jacket back there.
Hello there. My name is Nina Abelson, and from the looks of it, I just may be the most specific representative here of the millennial, single woman, educated in an urban area, so on and so forth. But my question is going possibly to all of you, but maybe Mark specifically, because you made a comment about the conservative meddling, and as somebody from my demographic, both my quite possibly age specifically, I have a very biased view that we try to connect and quote-unquote cross the aisle and so on and so forth and have a well-rounded opinionated view when we make an action, yet the most conservative of the conservatives seem to be very stuck to the status quo of their beliefs. So do you have any ideas on how, because you're speaking about with time and with generational progression, the conservatives will have to be focusing on a different method to make their own progress, how we can try and connect so it's not such a battle?
Mark, do you want to address that?
Well, I mean, I always thought one of the most, I mean, you know, I'm not on a campus or anything. I always thought, you know, one of the most interesting factoids of the last 4 or 5 years was that the Baylor University student paper endorsed gay marriage. I mean, you know, one of the most conservative campuses in the country. So generationally, it's just that, you know, the culture war stuff has fallen away. Even where there, and of course there are going to be hardcore conservatives, but let's not get distracted by this. You know, conservatives used to use the word remnant for themselves in the old William F. Buckley era. Let's not get distracted by this remnant that is still replaying the world of the early 90s. It will exist. There's a far broader group emerging in particularly in younger generations that basically has a different attitude about the culture war values and understands that that's not actually how they're going to build their next majority. You know, it's not our task to help them figure out how they build their next majority, but that ain't it.
Well, if I could add one quick thing on this, you know, I mentioned the findings on libertarian, and perhaps our friends at Cato will figure this out. There's a lot of people who can't identify or rate the libertarian label, but when you get into it, younger people are much more likely to give it a higher rating than others. When you break down the values, there are much more libertarian values among younger people. So, you know, 5 years from now, you might see a shift in that percentage of people looking favorably upon libertarian, perhaps if they find some candidates who might attract people.
No, it's interesting that young people are actually more progressive on the role of government,
right,
than, you know, older generations, which is kind of not the greatest base for libertarians.
On the cultural issues.
Cultural issues makes more sense,
yeah. So you have to help me out. Who's had their hand up a while and I've missed them? This gentleman over here, he's self-selected.
I guess it's addressed more to really than anyone. I noticed, you talk about the growth of metropolitan areas as a key factor in the growth of the progressive coalition. And one of the key factors in the growth of the Republican dominance was the growth and incredible Republican orientation of the, suburban donuts around some of our largest cities. Could you comment, do you see that changing? And because so many large urban areas where you have a progressive urban central city surrounded by a suburban, very Republican belt.
Well, that's a good question, and in fact, I don't remember the exact pages, but I actually discussed that for several pages in the report. Kind of the bottom line is that the suburbs have essentially gone progressive, and they've gone progressive because, partly because these outer suburbs you're alluding to, sometimes called exurbs or exurbia, they become far more competitive between progressives and conservatives, and in a lot of key and rapidly growing metro areas are actually starting to lean, toward, for example, they voted for Barack Obama. Take Loudoun County and Prince William County in the Northern Virginia part of the DC metro. There are lots of other examples. It was thought that since these counties are so rapidly growing and they seem to be pretty Republican or pretty conservative, that would provide them with a big advantage moving forward. That has really not turned out to be the case. These are heavily contested now between progressives and conservatives. There was only a 7-point deficit for Barack Obama looking at all these fast-growing outer suburbs or exurbs across the country, and he totally dominated the inner and mature suburbs, which is basically 64% of large metro areas. So the way things are working out, in fact, basically the battle line, the division between progressives and conservatives has now been moved pretty far out into the exurbs, and the Democrats or progressives dominate the rest of that suburban ring, and that's quite enough to make metro areas lean pretty heavily toward progressives at this point. And the larger they are, and the more faster growing they are, the more that's the case.
Mark, I don't know from your research, Mark Lopez, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that on specifically exurban areas.
If we want to talk about the Latino population, one of the things that we've seen around the country is that in 3,000 of the 3,100 counties in the United States, the Latino population has grown between 2000 and 2007. So in the last 7 years, we've seen Latino growth essentially everywhere around the country. I think that might be a marker for many other things as well, but certainly I do think that we're seeing a growth in many of these exurb areas of minority populations, including Hispanics, and that might partly explain what we're seeing generally.
Yeah, no, there are heavy shifts toward minorities in a lot of these fast-growing outer suburbs, much sharper than actually in the inner suburbs. That are, you can take a place like Douglas County, Colorado, which is a very conservative county outside of Denver. The growth rate of minorities in this suburb is just amazing. So the ground is shifting underneath people's feet, even as it keeps growing.
Next question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Judy Martinez, and I write a column on Hispanic issues for Politico. And as I hear y'all talk, I keep thinking about how the measurements are tied to Obama's election. But I wonder in the back of my mind how long it really will take for the politicians to catch up to the progressive movement. Because in the congressional districts, even though you have progressives voting more for Obama, there still is a split when they get further down the ballot. They are still voting more conservatively in some places. And so I wondered for your opinion as to how long you think it will take for the two to catch up, where we will actually see less conservatives, winning re-election or election in the first place.
It's an excellent question that's tied into the institutional arrangement of Congress and elections. But really, I don't know from your evidence if you have any sub-presidential data that might be able to answer that question.
Well, the farther, and Mark might have something to say about this too, the farther you get down the ballot, the harder it is to get good data broken out by race. But the general pattern is that Hispanics at local, sort of down the ballot, they do tend to vote pretty much like they do presidentially, though the farther down you get, there's more room for variation. But by and large, it's pretty heavily on one side. Local conditions or certain candidates sometimes change that quite a bit, but the pattern tends to be the same. And again, I think the underlying reason for that is what are Latinos' attitudes? What do they want out of life? What kind of things are they looking for in candidates? These are things that tend to tilt them toward the progressive candidate, just because of what their priorities, just because their views, just because of what they see the role of government as being. Progressives represent one side of that, conservatives another, and so by and large they're going to pick the progressive candidate, not as a perfect relationship, but just on average.
But like if I could give one state as an example,
okay.
Texas.
Mm-hmm.
It will always, they're going to have a contested gubernatorial this coming election, and there's not a prominent Democrat yet who has really thought. And when you look at the race, you're looking at the contest between Republicans, and there will be lots of Hispanics who will vote for the Republican gubernatorial candidate. So, and in that race, so you kind of wonder. And Obama was an exceptional candidate in so many ways. He is the exception. 8 years from now, will the progressives be as eager to vote for a candidate who is the next Democratic nominee and is not Obama?
Well, part of what we see in the survey evidence is that politicians in particular, both stripes, would be wise to embrace and pursue a pretty bold agenda of transformation in the country. And I think that's why President Obama is doing well, but there's no reason, and usually Congress is somewhat of a lagging indicator of the rest of the country, but there's no reason why candidates, and maybe somebody will figure this out and challenge some of these people, can't be advocating for pretty bold economic and activist government-oriented policies. I think that's part of what our data says in many ways. There's reason to have a confident progressive point of view on many of these things. Mark, I don't know if you had.
Yeah, I mean, I heard the question not entirely as limited to Latinos, although that's obviously part of the dimension. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think in a lot of areas, it goes back to the previous question. The rise of a local Democratic and Progressive Party coincides with change, and in some ways precedes change at the national level. So that in Rui's paper, for example, he has a large section on the Philadelphia suburbs, and this is true in the New York suburbs. It's certainly in Connecticut. I think it's probably true in Chicago area as well. The set of issues that actually those were the classic Republican suburban strongholds, not the suburban strongholds of the 80s and 90s, but of the 20s and 30s. Historically, I mean, registration through the roof Republican, but fundamentally not comfortable with the crazy conservative Republican Party. So after a period of time, they shifted. That also was driven, certainly in Pennsylvania, probably in some of the other cases, by development fights that made people much more comfortable with the role of government and actually creating a livable county, livable area for them, and that's a huge local transformation. At the gubernatorial level, I think what's interesting, obviously there are and you know, so the Democratic trends in overall state legislatures, you know, have been huge since even in '04. I think there was a solid Democratic majority across all legislatures, which includes states like Oklahoma, where they're all very, very conservative Democrats, but less than there were in the past, and that's steadily increased. And if you talk to state legislators, they'll sometimes say, well, you know, these Republicans, you know, the few ideologues, they're basically not ideologues, but the Republicans did create a little bit more of an ideological group. The interesting thing, though, you know, I've tried to think about some ways in which the Republicans build a comeback. Obviously, Republican governors are the key to any, you know, it is not going to be John Boehner who brings the Republican Party back into the sunlight. It's going to be somebody like Mitch Daniels or Tim Pawlenty in Minnesota, somebody like that, who could sort of show, and to me this was very much the story of the 1990s, was all those big state Republican governors who made it seem like conservatism was potentially a governing philosophy. A lot of them were running scams, using their pension funds and things like that to make it look like they were governing effectively. But they made people feel like conservatism could be effective. And I think when people first looked at George W. Bush, they felt like he was kind of one of those guys, like John Engler in Michigan or Christy Whitman in New Jersey, and that was not an unfamiliar type, and it turned out not to be true. But I think as you go forward, some of those governors will be important to the Republicans.
Dan? We've got time for two more questions, I believe.
Okay.
And we're happy to talk with folks afterwards as well.
Yeah, I'm Dan Martin, Conservation International, and you have all of these trend data that go over a long term, but when you came down to your questions and the aggregate being 209 on a 400-point scale, that sounds to me like a very centrist position. You interpreted that as a strong lean in one direction, and it seems to me like a pretty thin lean and kind of natural centrism. How do you
Yeah, no, my
think about that?
interpretation was that it's decisively progressive because it's on one side versus the other, but it's not excessively so. And when you compare it with the other data, which is the attitudes on the 40 questions, where the consensus is greatest among progressive ideas, and you add that to the new data on self-identification, which shows a more evenly divided country, we see it's leaning progressive. It's not excessively so, and I don't think it's necessarily permanent. Some of the demographic trends might put that in place, but one of the things we're clear about in the report is that there is residual strength of the conservative worldview. A lot of people believe ideas on both sides of the ideological divide. Right now, most of those core conservative ideas are sublimated in relation to progressive ideas, but there's no reason why the conservative movement couldn't figure out a way to tap into that. Now, Mark's point is valid here. There doesn't appear to be evidence that they're going in that direction. So if they were to moderate their views in some cases on economics, at least from a more populist progressive side, if they were culturally traditional but not extreme, perhaps more realist on foreign policy and not as sort of gung-ho neocon. You might be able to pull off a Cameron-style rebranding of their side, but that doesn't appear to be the case. So I think in the short term, even though the slight lean it is in the middle, but it is progressive, and it's backed up by a range of attitudes that are strongly progressive.
Center left.
Okay, we have, I apologize, we have, why don't we just see if we can get 3 quick questions.
Maybe, yeah, people could just give them, we take them all at once.
We're gonna pool questions, so please, let's just get 3 right here, please, that'd be great.
My name is Chris Murray. I teach political science from Marquette University here in DC. My question is kind of similar to the earlier one about Hispanic voters and kind of comparing this period of progressive ascendancy to maybe the one of conservative ascendancy prior to it. And do some of the trends that you're identifying kind of point to a ceiling of ascendancy, thinking like the electoral map, like you saw with Republicans? So I guess, could you see Democrats winning South Carolina and Oklahoma like Republicans were winning California and New York?
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Allison Owens, attorney from Columbia, Maryland. To whom was the study or the survey distributed, and how long, over what period of time was the survey conducted?
And one more.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on the Mark Nadell, frequent visitor. I was struck by the fact that the less educated were less progressive. And I was wondering whether you've explored the possibility that some of the less progressiveness might be out of ignorance, where people express positions that are inconsistent, as in they're in favor of getting the government out of the marketplace until a situation occurs, and then they say, why wasn't the government here to stop this from happening? Or we want a smaller government, we want lower taxes, but hey, we need a stronger military, we need to spend more on this, we need more on healthcare, we need more whatever. So that if they had to reconcile and come up with a consistent position, it would turn out to be more progressive.
Okay, thank you. Just to be clear on that, the education division is it's more complicated than being less progressive or not progressive. There are more progressive positions among those with a high school degree or less on things like the role of corporations and the wealthy and public policy. The need to fight inequality. There are a range of things that are more progressive than their postgraduate educated counterparts. Where you see more conservatism is on the cultural side and on things like the use of military force to combat terrorism. We didn't explore, this was not an advocacy poll. We wanted test-based attitudes. We weren't trying to convince people one way or another. We were just presenting the attitudes. The question, the poll was administered to national samples. It was 1,400 Americans. And then we have a companion survey that combines about 915 interviews with young people. It was conducted in February over about an 8-day period. And we're distributing all of the data and the reports widely. They're all available at our website. So, Rui, do you want to take the ascendancy question real quick?
Yeah, I don't think we've hit the ceiling necessarily. I mean, these demographic trends are going to continue for quite a while. And there's a lot of discussion in the report about how long some of them are likely to go. I mean, some of them, like minority growth, is pretty locked in. There's a little bit more doubt about how educational upgrading, how long the college-educated population is going to continue to grow. Of course, that's susceptible to public policy. But I think that, by and large, they will continue, and they're going to put other states in play, I think. I mean, Texas is totally not out of the question as things move forward. Basically, where the fast growth areas of the United States are where a lot of these trends are having their greatest effects. So John McCain may have taken Arizona in 2008, but don't be surprised if Barack Obama manages to take it in 2012. Look at Georgia and how close it was this time. I think there's a lot of states out there that are going to get that can easily get pretty close. And again, where growth is taking place, that's where progressives are likely to having opportunities in the future beyond the ones they've already taken advantage of.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have. We appreciate you staying with us. Many thanks to the Marks for their insightful comments. And thanks to John and Rui for joining us today. And have a nice afternoon.